Hi there. In this video we'll be talking about the American Revolution, or as some historians have come to call it, the War for Independence. Although historians have been arguing productively about the revolution for decades, it's fair to say that since around 1920 or so, the arguments have all boiled down to a single question. Was the revolution radical or not? Or more to the point, was it a revolution or not? Is it more appropriate to call it simply a war for independence from Britain, or is it appropriate to call it, say, a revolution, more along the lines of more radical revolutions like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution in 1917? Some historians have argued that we shouldn't call the revolution radical because before the revolution happened, the American colonies were already democratic. They've suggested that all of these people here ready to pull down King George's statue, that they were feeling very democratic and, you could say, revolutionary or anti-authority long before the revolution happened, and that the revolution just sort of cemented a process that was already taking place. Other historians, especially in the last 30 years or so, have argued exactly the opposite. They've argued that colonial America wasn't very democratic. For instance, the fact that this big old statue of King George was standing smack dab in the middle of New York City would be suggestive of that, but that the revolution helped make America much more democratic, much more anti-authoritarian, and more involved in considering equality as a key marker of their society. Now we'll have occasion to think about this more as we progress in the class, to think about whether American behaviors changed much during and after the Revolution. You might consider for this class, though, whether the description of the Boston Tea Party that you find, or Jefferson's article about his ideas about American rights, suggests that Americans' behavior and especially ideas prior to the Revolution were democratic or not. But a related and equally unsolved question relates to how the Revolution helped or hurt certain groups of people. One of these groups of people, an essential one given some of the stated goals of the Revolution, was poor working people. One historian has found, for instance, that the Revolution doesn't appear to have made a major dent in inequality. So, for instance, if you were poor before the Revolution, there was a pretty darn good chance that you were going to stay poor after the Revolution. It's possible to make that argument. It's possible to say, and I'd like you to think about whether we can say that, that this is just a room full of rich dudes making sure that they can stay rich by becoming independent from Britain. On the other hand, other very good historians have made the argument that American attitudes among the poor and working class changed markedly before and after the Revolution, that Americans stopped being deferential to people in authority. So if these were colonial leaders, and most of them were, Americans after the Revolution stopped bowing to them. They stopped saying sir. They started talking to them as though they were equals. So those are both interesting questions and some that you might very well pursue. The possible contradictions here, the question of equality is, or are, even more profound in terms of race. Did African Americans benefit from the Revolution? It is particularly ironic, even at times cruel, to speak of a war of independence or a war fought for liberty when a great majority of African Americans was enslaved by the very revolutionaries fighting in the war. We'll be reading documents offering evidence of two very different experiences of black soldiers, but this point is worth emphasizing. Most African Americans, if you asked them about it, would have said that the Patriot side in the war, what we would think of as the American side in the war, was not as good a bet as the British or Loyalist side. And indeed, the British, hoping to cause economic and social chaos in America, giving them a better chance to win the war, did offer freedom to slaves who would join the Loyalists, and they offered protection to slaves who left Patriot masters, which is why we have evidence that numerous African Americans fought for the British in the Revolutionary War. The Patriots, or I suppose what we think of as the Americans, offered African Americans a much less certain prospect, and included among their leaders some of America's biggest and most powerful slaveholders, including, people like, say, George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. Knowing that makes the experience of black soldiers in the Revolutionary Army that much harder to decipher. Why would they do this? How were they treated? What were their experiences? Did they expect that all the language of liberty that patriots were using would eventually apply to them, even though many patriots were, of course, slaveholders? The other factor to consider in terms of how revolutionary the Revolution was is the form of government that the Revolution created. Early on in the Revolution, in 1777, the 13 colonies agreed to, and eventually, by 1781, ratified their first form of independent government, and this was under the Articles of Confederation. Now, this was, in many ways, a temporary expedient, something that the colonies agreed to do so that they could get on with the business of fighting a war without fighting each other too much. But it was an extremely limited national government, and you get a little sense of that by this copy of the Articles. And this copy here makes it clear that the states are every bit as much as important as the Confederation, perhaps more important. Can you imagine, say, the U.S. Constitution listing all of the states? But here the Articles of Confederation do. They list all 13 colonies, as though all 13 colonies were equally important. The national government instituted by the Articles is mostly interesting for having relatively little power, and in fact its limitations are in some ways just as interesting as its capabilities. So you'll notice that Congress could not raise an army. It could not regulate trade between the states. Most significantly, perhaps, it could not levy taxes. So especially for raising an army and levying taxes, what Congress had to do in each case was request that the states comply with their demands. So, dear Massachusetts, it'd be swell if you would raise an army, but they couldn't actually have an army of its own. That would seem too much like King George's Continental soldiers. Similarly, levying taxes. Dear Virginia, would you please pay some taxes? That too seemed in many ways too similar to King George's ability to tax the colonists at will. So you could see that the colonists and the revolutionaries, in putting together these Articles of Confederation, desperately wanted to limit the power of national government, not at all surprisingly, since they were fighting a strong national government in the Revolution. You will also notice that even in legislating and making law, the Articles gave a great deal of power to states. Notice, for one thing, that each state had an equal vote. There were 13 voting states. It wasn't like today where votes were apportioned by population. Providence and Rhode Island were every bit as important as New York in this arrangement, which is something that we still have a relic of in the Constitution, in the fact that each state gets 2 senators. Notice also that it was very difficult to pass national legislation. It required a great deal of unity. 9 out of 13 states must vote in favor of a law in order to approve that law. And if you wanted to amend that law, 13 out of 13, all of the states must vote in favor in order to amend the Articles. Now, in 1787, a group of former revolutionary leaders, including people like George Washington and James Madison, met in hopes of getting rid of the Articles and instituting a new, stronger government. And there's no denying that the Constitution that they created, which is still the Constitution that we exist under today in America, was much more effective as a national government than the Articles of Confederation were. And we'll be looking at the Constitution in some depth. But a point that that many historians have made, and have been pillarized for making in some cases, is that the document they produced may well have undone some of the measures that the founders had originally designed to ensure Americans' freedoms. Other historians argue against them, noting that the stronger national government created by the Constitution was necessary in order to ensure Americans' freedoms. And I should say, if there's a bigger question to deal with in American history, I don't know what it is. Whether a strong government is a better way of ensuring citizens' freedoms than a weak government. So, there should be lots to think about here. It is, after all, the moment of America's founding as a nation, so go to it.